Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm delighted to be here tonight with Siobhan Phillips to celebrate her book, Benefit. Brand new novel just out in mid-April. So we are catching her relatively early in her touring and talking about the book. And I've known Siobhan for a little while, and some of our mutual friends are in the audience. So it is always like one of the best parts of my job to get to talk to people who are my actual friends in real life about their beautiful work. And I always tell people, I do have other friends who have written books, and I don't ask everyone to do this because I only do it if I really like their books and their work. And this book is great. So I just want to say that off to the top. You have a background in poetry, and that really comes through. And so I thought maybe if we could just begin by you talking about this maybe bird's eye view of the book. Tell the folks at home who haven't read it yet, just kind of the elevator pitch, and then we can go from there.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor, a real honor to be part of the Charis Conversation series. I'm really so pleased to be here. So thank you. Yeah, so the book is set, I suppose, to start off, it would be good to know that the book is set in 2011 and then looks back to 2001, around that time period, and then sort of looks back 100 years earlier in a couple of different places. But it's really about that first decade or so of the 21st century. And the characters in this book were all young people sort of just starting out in adulthood at the beginning of the 21st century. So from the perspective of 2011, they're looking back and trying to figure out kind of what the decade meant. And that, of course, means thinking about the wars, financial crisis, all sorts of upheaval. The book is set in the US, so upheaval in the US and around the world, and just a lot of senses of crises and various crises, and everything that kind of happened in the first decade of the 21st century. But then also thinking about how those war, financial crisis, all relate to and connect to historical stories, trends, threads. So the book is kind of about thematic. So in the story, it's following this one main character. It's first person as she tries to figure out what she's going to do, what she's supposed to do, and also as she's sort of researching the history of this prestigious fellowship that she and others she knows benefited from, and that research and that investigation and those conversations are part of a larger consideration of how we understand and then deal with the fact that I'm saying we, but people in general, are often born into and then inhabit institutions and historical stories and situations that are not good, that are not things we would maybe endorse or want to see perpetuated, and yet they are here and part of our history. And so what do we do with that? What do we do with the things that have shaped us already and that we're kind of living through and in with, even without our maybe being aware of them, or even with our being aware of them? Because we're all living, I should stop saying we, but I think that's a we. I mean, we're all living in institutions of various kinds, or thinking about institutions of various kinds. And yeah, that continues. I should, yeah. So that's the kind of overall plot, and it's a lot of this main character, Laura, talking to her friends and former acquaintances and others, and kind of trying to navigate this weird time in her life. And Laura is a former academic. She's a sort of researcher by training, and so the book is also about can research help you? Does knowing more about the past, knowing more about where you are and how things got this way, is that useful at all? Or how useful is it and in what way? So,
yeah, I love that question. It's a question that's been on my mind a lot because I'm in a writing group, writing class right now with people who are in the generation mostly in the generation younger than us.
mm-hmm.
And so I loved being in this sort of micro generation with you. That was like I turned my 21st birthday was the day that Bush declared war on Iraq, right? So I was like sitting at the bar watching all, that all unfold on the news.
Yes.
And I think we have a very specific relationship to that war,
yes.
and then again to Occupy and things like that.
Yes.
Well, and of course the financial crisis, because that hit
yes.
right as we were coming into adulthood. So those three things are really present, I think,
yes.
in our personal timelines of adulthood.
Yes.
But I'm in this writing class with younger writers who were in their 20s and very early 30s, and they're writing very futuristic stuff. They're like,
yes,
I don't care to revisit any of this. Like, I'm
yes.
not interested in the past. I don't really care how we got here because it's all fucked. So like,
yes.
let's just keep it moving and figure out
yes.
what's happening next, which I find totally fascinating. But I think the orientation to the past and trying to understand feels deeply ingrained in me, and I think is very important in this book. And so
yes,
I was thinking about like particularly being in this micro generation, right? The book starts with a symposium on the Iraq War 10 years later.
Yes.
And about sort of, and this guy, Mark, who was a soldier and was also a student with Laura, and his complicity, in choosing to be a soldier. There's a lot, he may become a politician. There's a lot of great, incisive, funny stuff about how, one is supposed to be against the war, but pro veteran and pro soldier. And that actually like, that's the best possible positioning for a politician, which is true in America. Right. So I'm just thinking about, as you thought about the framing of this book, how did you arrive at beginning with the war? And particularly the symposium?
Well, that's great. Yes, that's a fabulous question. And it's true. I have thought, everything you said about generations, it's such an interesting question, I think, especially for people we're, I think, almost exactly the same age. So that's, it's a weird and strange thing to feel, not only that, we're all living through history, but living through history in this very particular phase of history. So starting with the war, that was really the impetus. Because I realized, and when I started this book a long time ago, it took me a while to write this, but it was a moment in which I thought, like, what is these wars, this decade of war, and the US's ongoing military involvement around the globe, like that all leads back to the quote unquote war on terror and those events. Like, what does this mean? I mean, I knew what it meant intellectually, but what is actually my relationship to this? And that did feel very singular because of the kind of war that it was, my own position in life and in the world, and then the age and moment that I had lived through. And so I realized that I was reading a lot of books about this. I read and thought and was reading books, not just accounts of people who had experienced the war, who were veterans who had experienced the war in various different ways, but books that were trying to make sense of this, and then also just books about war in general. And so then I thought, processing this and trying to figure it out, that's when this kind of fictional idea, this idea of this kind of fiction began, because it was a way for me to think through this question And by inventing characters, I could think through this question from different angles, if that made sense. I mean, it wasn't quite as intellectual and analytic as that. I wish it were. It would have been clearer and maybe quicker. But it was a way for me to say, okay, how does this question kind of reflect through the prismatically through different kinds of experiences in this moment? What is the warming for this, for that, for the other? And then that also, in some ways, led to the kind of history I was investigating and learning about and trying to learn about in this book, because the historical moment this book is investigating or talking through is the kind of longer historical moment is a time period around the turn of the 20th century. And this moment of a new kind or a different kind or a particular kind of US imperialism and war that I think, for me at least, was not that large of a presence in my thinking of or accounting of US history. So it wasn't a matter of, I wasn't drawing equivalences or trying to think through it wasn't a matter of me looking at patterns or repetitions, but just thinking of, oh, how does this experience of war and my relationship to my understanding of this experience of war relate to my understanding of previous US military involvements and wars and aggressions and imperialism. And so that was the kind of snowball that began with that question. Well, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, in this, obviously the Iraq war and then the Afghanistan wars and all of those things. I mean, it was so much about resource hoarding, which we came to find out that, so much of this was about oil, which some folks knew, of course, in 2001, but that was not the narrative. And the Weatherfield scholarship, which is sort of an analog maybe for the Rhodes Scholarship or some other scholarships, is funded by sugar, right? And so that is another kind of resource, and people think of sugar as sort of innocuous, like, oh, like I think we think of, we don't have in our contemporary imagining sugar is demonized for fat phobic reasons, but not demonized for its links to enslavement and its links to imperialism and colonization and all the other things that are really.
Fat phobia is also linked to that.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. It's
So yeah. I mean, that to me was a very clear moment, but I think you do such a good job of leading us, by taking us sort of into these students who are privileged enough to receive the scholarship, regardless of whether or not they are wealthy, coming from wealthy homes. There's this sort of great equalizer in getting this scholarship, right? All of a sudden, all of these students are in this incredibly elite space, but it is funded by this sort of poisonous well. And that is true. I mean, you and I both have been in elite academic spaces at various times, and one only needs to look at the names on the buildings to realize that. But so most academic spaces, students are dissuaded from doing that, right? Like, you are absolutely not supposed to ask who funded this space, right? And certainly one is never supposed to ask who funded my scholarship. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, obviously you're an academic now, and you what was your relationship to exploring those things as an academic now?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, right? This is such a great question. Thank you. And there's so many different parts to this. I'm going to inevitably forget parts of your wonderful question, but it is really interesting. I do think there is more and more investigation of this. Very recently, I think it was just last week, Harvard released their huge report on the history of Harvard as an institution, its involvement with slavery, and it's incredibly thorough. I mean, some amazing Harvard historians and other scholars involved in it, but a very thorough report, and with recommendations and details. And I think certainly like in my college, there's been ongoing historical work with a committee and scholars and professors and students investigating this, again, in the case of slavery and how the institution benefited from, I'm sorry to keep using that word, it's not intentional, but how the institution has, just how the history of institutions have intersected with and built from and taken from this other horrific history. And I think that is growing. It's been recent, but I think it's more and more the case that is happening. But I think it was less prevalent or acknowledged, I think, in 2011 or like, I think that has been a relative, I don't know the history of all of this. But yeah, so, and that's really important work, right? And that's partly, it is the space of academia and of scholarship is really interesting in this regard, because I learned from, was able to write this book because of so much amazing scholarship from which I learned, and historical scholarship, anthropological, sociological, scholarship in all sorts of fields, interdisciplinary fields. And so that's the academia as a place can protect and encourage and allow for that investigation at its best. It can allow for that kind of pursuit of the knowledge, even of its own foundations and its own institutional origins. So that, I think, it's partly why I put a academic or a former academic, failed academic at the center of this book, and also really wanted to think through like the process of, I mean, this book I'm going to make it sound incredibly boring. It's not about like the process of research. But it's about like the need or the desire to figure things out, if that is ever possible. But then sugar, there's so many, it's such a fascinating topic. And I feel like certainly in the novel, I only scratched the surface, and even in my own understanding, I've only scratched the surface. But I mean, my own like outside of the novel understanding of it, I've only scratched the surface. But as you were suggesting, I found sugar and the history of sugar so fascinating, even in its horrific and aspects, because it does show how just extensive a history of this kind can be, and touching on so many things, touching on war and colonization and race and gender and economics and how those different legacies are still present today, and in the geography of our cities and countries, and so I found that really fascinating and wanted to pursue that. And then sugar also is, I mean, it's something we consume, right? It's something that literally becomes it can become part of someone. And it's also sugar is a sweet and pleasant taste for most people. So and the book is also the main character in the book, her mother is a cook. And so there is some thoughts in the book about food and eating. And I love talking about food studies. I'm someone who reads cookbooks for fun and loves thinking about the history of food and how it intersects with other histories. But that also was fascinating to me, that this is a commodity that then becomes part of people's meals and rituals and families and recipes, and then part of their consumption, part of their tastes and their preferences, and then part of their bodies. And yeah, and that's kind of unavoidable. That's just how the world works. But it's also made the story for me that much more interesting and powerful. The story of sugar, I mean, yeah.
I do want to come back to talking about her mother, but first, Laura begins as a Henry James scholar.
Yes,
And
Henry James, yeah.
Henry James is such a fascinating guy, and I feel like people put a lot of stuff on Henry James. So I'm wondering, like, queer people read him as queer, like, other people who are interested in him being sort of like a quasi like celibate religious figure sometimes read that on him.
Right.
People put a lot on him. And
Yes.
all of the horror geeks claim him, and then like people have all kinds of feelings about him, but I am thinking about him as somebody who has a lot of feelings about people being used and being used up, and like who gets to be consumed. And so I was thinking, I thought it was really interesting that she's a Jamesian. And so
yes,
I wondered if you always knew that she was going to be a Jamesian, or if she studied somebody else at any other point.
That is a fascinating question, because I think, yes, she was always a Jamesian. And it's almost like it was a kind of intuitive thing. I was like, oh, I know kind of who she is and what she looks like and a little how she thinks. I'm going to learn more, I hope, at the beginning this was. And she's a Henry James scholar, and it's really it is incredibly, I think, because I'm an academic. I teach at a college and I'm around scholars, and it's always interesting to think about the relationship of the subject of someone's scholarship to their own life and personality and preferences and history, and then how that changes. Because certainly my scholarship has changed a lot, or did change a lot, and I'm glad for that. But yeah, the Henry James, of course, I don't think I would have chosen Henry James if I didn't really like Henry James's work. I do. I think he's a fascinating and really interesting writer. And of course, he was writing at this time that I was mentioning, kind of the turn of the 20th century. You mentioned kind of wonderfully all the different ways Henry James has been kind of described and claimed and categorized. And he's also one of these figures kind of on the cusp of 19th century tradition and a more 20th century modernist tradition. So I thought she was a James scholar from the start. And it was also like, then I had to like reread a lot of James, which was nice. And I was reading James, and then I was thinking also about other novels that I love that I felt were indebted to James or in conversation with James in some way, which was also just really nice to revisit that group, not that I'm like, this always sounds kind of awful, because I'm not like putting my novel with these people or this group, you know what I'm saying? But when you think about like works you love, and like how writing gives you an opportunity to revisit these works and think about them more, for example, I love the novels of James Baldwin, all of them, but especially the later novels, Another Country and Just Above My Head. And there's, Baldwin loved James, and there's this great interview and accounts of how he was thinking about The Ambassadors, which is a Henry James novel, when he was writing Another Country, and how those books are talking to each other. And then there's like, Alan Hollinghurst and I don't know, like Rachel Cusk. These are all people who I think are like James related, which was, I really loved thinking. It was like pleasant for me to think about that, and to think about how the themes in James, as well as James's example of kind of novelistic art are just so complex and rich and various, and people have taken them in different ways, as you were saying. So it was a pleasure. How it relates to Laura's personality? Well, Laura is kind of in love with difficulty, or in love with a certain kind of difficulty, which is probably protective or defensive in a kind of way in her character. And James is, or she sees James as a way of embracing difficulty, or embracing a novelist who is seen as difficult or who might be difficult. And then the fact that she's like a single author scholar, I thought was also interesting, because it suggests a kind of sense of focus or narrowness, which also might be part of her personality and her drive.
But also loyalty, I think, is interesting. Like, yes. I mean, because I think she's a really great main character, because especially in a novel that is about sort of the ethics of action versus passivity, and like what constitutes action, I think, and whether or not scholarship constitutes action, right? Or philanthropy, does that constitute action? I mean, I think what's great about this is that there's so many, and we haven't even really gotten to the interpersonal, which is so alive in this book, but everything is working on the interpersonal and the social level. But then also, I do think, this is a social novel in the sense of the larger social problems novels, right? And that you're trying to talk about all of these moving pieces of our history. And I think you don't get to see, that's my favorite kind of book. So I'm very,
thank you. I would love to. Yeah. Thank you. That's such a nice, mine too, or among many, but yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah. And so, but I mean, and certainly James Baldwin is writing those, and I think Henry James is, right? And so it makes sense to me. And, for a long time in recent years, there had been sort of a trend against the social novel, I would say, like to these very like super personal, very small worlds, right? Which I often find really boring, but other people seem to love, right? And no shade to any of those authors, because that's a huge art form in and of itself, right? Like, it is very difficult to make the world of something very intimate, but it's never been my cup of tea. I'm much more interested in the individual in relationship to things on a large scale. And so it made total sense to me that she was a Jamesian, and then that there are all these other resonances. But so I was thinking about the other characters in this book. So she's friends with a range of people who also were in this same academic program. And one of the great things about this, so the thing that I guess surprised me the most, knowing you, just this much, is how funny this book is. Not because I didn't think that you would be funny, but that this book is very funny.
I'm glad. I didn't. Yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah, like I wasn't, like even just like the marketing of it, I was like, oh, this is gonna be like serious literary fiction. Excellent, I'm here for it. But it's very funny, and I think it's very funny without being mean, which I think is really hard to do. And so I wonder, and the way it's funny specifically is in the characterizations of the small self-delusions that we all tell ourselves to get through the day about how we're living under capitalism, basically. Like these negotiations of like, yeah, I'm going to do this thing. I know it's corrupt. Gonna do it anyway, because this is what we're all doing, right? And like, but then wanting acquaintances or friends to be like, it's fine. Yeah, don't worry about it. We all do it. And the way that we can all, especially smart people, especially people whose identity is being smart and being able to name things, to be able to be like, yes, we all know what's going on here. We're all going to call it by the newest word we're supposed to call it. We all know what we're doing, but then we're going to go participate in the system wholeheartedly. And I found that critique, to a T. There's several characters who in different ways embody that trait of like great self-knowledge in some ways and total lack of self-knowledge in other ways. And I think, and Laura is that way too, but is much more able to see how other people are that way. And in part because her she's not of quite the same world that the rest of these characters are. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you built empathy for the other characters and how you thought about them and sort of raised them beyond type, because they very easily could have fallen victim to like, oh, that's the like, dramatic writer guy who takes up, he's a narcissist or whatever, right? Or Mark could have just been like Mr. Square Jaw blockhead, like there are a lot of things that these folks could have been, and they end up being three-dimensional, even as it's very clear where the book is telling us to put our attention, I guess.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you found it funny and thought that about the characters. I think I was kind of starting to say this earlier. Maybe I'm just thinking through this now. I really did create the characters as ways of, and this is what I think. One of the things that fiction offers, both in writing it and reading it and thinking about it, are ways of imagining and inhabiting different ways of being, or a means of inhabiting different ways of being, and different personalities and people and experiences. And that is obvious and not, but there were all of the characters I wanted to know and I wanted to learn from. And all of the characters are things that I've felt or were part of me, or I wanted to. I think that I did really feel like I wanted to, invent these people so I could then talk to them and learn from them and listen to them. It sounds kind of weird. I'm just thinking about a moment in, there's a wonderful piece by Larissa McFarquhar about Hilary Mantel. And, both of those, writer and subject are great writers and great writers of character. And the piece describes how Hilary Mantel imagines her characters and then talks to them, like interviews them in her head to figure out who they are. And this moment when it's talking with Jane O'Brien, which is a fabulous Hilary Mantel novel. This moment when she meets the Jane O'Brien in her head, meets the main character of this book in her head, and realizes that she knows him and she can talk to him. And that, I think, is just like such a magical moment for me. And I'm not Hilary Mantel, but the ambition to do that and to really create people that can surprise you, can tell you something you didn't know, and wanted to know, and can show you something that you wouldn't have seen some other way. Like, that was really, for me, part of the goals of writing the book.
So I think that makes total sense to me. And I like the idea these folks are all kind of like prisms, like different ways of seeing. So there's Mark, who is the veteran and would-be politician, who is sort of earnest, and particularly when they're young, seems almost like simultaneously as much of an outsider as Laura, but also very sought after. Like, everybody likes him, and he's a joiner, and so he's one character. And then we have Heather, who is beautiful, and she went to a state school and is very smart, and really is sort of like the woman best friend, but it's a tenuous, complicated relationship, and she's kind of the person that Laura weighs herself against in a number of ways, most clearly about things like external appearance and money and geography and things like that. Like, her success is very, like, Laura doesn't want her life, but she's very clearly this like yardstick. And then Greta is like the sort of outspoken, messy, like funny lesbian character who knows how to like kind of work the system and do a lot of sort of navigating of things in ways that indicate both like you admire it, but you also are like, oh, you're very embroiled in the system. And then Justin is like the very funny, successful, like great on Twitter, bon mot kind of writer who is actually the person who originally was brought in to do the Weatherfield writing, and then decides he's not really that into it. So of all of those characters, did you begin with one before the other, or were they all kind of emerging at the same time?
They all sort of emerged at this. Well, I'm not really. I don't remember exactly. This is a great question. They pretty much emerged at the same time, but I think. I mean, the chapters are after. Yeah, the chapter is kind of each chapter in the beginning of the book describes, or in each chapter, Laura is engaged most with one of these people, and I knew the kind of constellation, like I knew the group of people that would be in this book, and then there were some others. Yeah, I knew the group of people that were in this book, and then I pretty much wrote the chapters in the order that they are, kind of thinking through these different people in order. Yeah. I think that's kind of how it happened. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Yeah. And then, Laura is, she is kind of more or less close to these people. I mean, not all of them she has the same kind of level of closeness to. So then it was also kind of figuring out how to understand these characters and be able to talk with these characters depending on Laura's different relationship with each of them too. So
one of the things that I really love about it is these kinds of academic programs do foster a unique sense of bonding.
Yes.
Sometimes trauma bonding, but usually like, oh, we did this very elite special thing for a limited amount of time. And so we are at a very pivotal time in our lives, right? Mm-hmm. So we are bonded together. I certainly have friends that I am still in touch with 20 years later because we went through a program, not quite this elite, but like a program that was special in that way, and that made us feel special and important when we were young, right? And I think that group dynamic is as important as the individual dynamic, the one-to-one. And even at the Weatherfield fundraiser, these old people for whom this was still the most important thing they ever did, and they want to keep being like, oh, but tell me about your life, and surely this was the best day of your life too. And I think that's so smart to have that be this unifying container, because it really helps. Like, that's also the thing about privilege that I think is so like confusing to explain to people who have not experienced it, who are like, I'm sorry, how do you know these people? Like, why is this person doing a favor for you? Like, how does this like very white rich world work? Like, you went to a basically like summer program together in the 90s and you still are like scratching each other's backs now. Like, why? Right? But I think that kind of nepotism and that kind of closed world is how the world works, right? And and certainly in this world, and it's a very, what I really admire about this is it's a very shorthand way to get at a ton of that, pretty toxic stuff, but that also feels good if you're in it, right? Similar to the sugar analogy. It's like, it's very easy as it goes down, and then you take some steps back from it and you're like, oh yeah, I guess I was a part of this thing that actually doesn't feel very good to look at from the outside. And like, everybody should get the opportunities that I got, and they don't. And so what do I do with it as an adult? And it's interesting to see what each of these characters sort of makes a different thing, 10 years on of their experience. And that's very telling.
Absolutely. Yes, I just want to agree. But I also feel that, and this gets back to the question of institutions and people, and people make institutions, but then institutions shape people, and how do we shape institutions, or how are we shaped by them? The friendships and relationships among people, can you separate those from, you were saying, like the container or the institution in which those relationships happened? Because I do think, like, in the book, well, for example, the relationship between Laura and Heather, which is extremely, complicated and not always honest on Laura's side or Heather's, but it's a real relationship. And even at the end of the book, when things are uncertain, I'm not sure, knowing these people, that I want to say they shouldn't be. I mean, that's not for me to say, really. What do I know? But I think that one of the questions is, what do you do with the real, genuine human relationships that come out of and that are part of non-ideal situations, right? Because those should not be sacrificed, maybe, or don't have to be sacrificed. But also sometimes they need to be changed or altered or revised. So yeah, that's definitely part of it. Exactly what you're describing.
Well, and sometimes you wake up and you're in your 30s or 40s and realize that all you had was the container. And I do think it's I think it's interesting to wonder what happens. We don't want to spoil anything, but beyond the frame of the book with those two characters in particular, because I could see them like evolving their friendship. And I hope, actually, I'm rooting for them, but I don't know. And actually, we have a question in the chat that sort of speaks to this. So our friend Frankie asks, your novel has so many complicated characters, especially the women, so many interesting women of different generations. I want to ask about Florence, whose story seems to be a parable about the limits of research and how much we can know others. How do you think about her role in the novel? So first, can you explain who Florence is in the book for folks who haven't read it?
Yes. Thank you. I would love to. So Florence is, there was like the man whose money established this fellowship. His name is Weatherfield, last name is Weatherfield. And, but the person who actually got the scholarship off the ground was, in the story of the book, was his widow, his wife, after he died. And her name was Florence. And so but there is very little knowledge of her at all, and like why she did this exactly, and what her life was or what her motivations were. There's more about her husband, and then her husband's family, which is the family of the sugar fortune. This is that I invented. I invented all these people, obviously. And so Laura, as she's researching this sort of toxic history, seizes on or focuses on the figure of Florence, and trying to figuring out where she's coming from, what's her motivation, what's she like, as if this will offer some key to the whole thing, or as if this will offer some way for Laura herself to know how to think about this whole history. But of course, I shouldn't say of course, but that impulse it's not always possible to know, right? To understand that. And then there's also a chapter in the book that kind of imagines possible lives for Florence. And so Florence is, in the book, sort of like the possible Henry James heroine, right? And the figure that could be for Laura like a James character, but the question is, how far does that get you? That's Florence. She's a parable, I think, exactly as the question says. She's a kind of parable about the limits of research. I love that idea. And then also a parable about the kind of interplay of research and fiction, maybe, which is also part of that. So, yeah, I would say, but Florence, and she was fun. It was fun for me to imagine and write and think through these, possible histories and what that world might have been like.
So
Yeah.
another wild woman in the book is Lois, who is Florence's like great niece.
Yes.
And she is a very lively broad. And so she's just a character, like in the best sense of that word and the worst sense of that word. And I wonder if she is sort of a little bit of a, be careful what you wish for, like a cautionary tale of like, oh, you want to be free? This is what freedom looks like too, that is how I took her, but I'm curious.
Yes. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you're right. I didn't write that down because I didn't, Lois is one of the characters I didn't I didn't necessarily plan or expect that she would show up. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, she has to talk to this person who is the relative and might have some papers and archival documents. And then she goes to the apartment and it's like, oh, okay. Then Lois starts just telling her life story. And I do think that's true. And for Laura, it's like another one of these examples of, okay, this is one way you can relate to this history or take from or think about this history. Lois was that figure. Yeah.
Well, there's also, I think so Lois is a painter, a not very good painter. Yes. There's such I think
Laura doesn't think so anyway.
Yeah. Academics who are not also artists, many academics are also artists or writers, but academics who are not can often glorify or reify artists, and there can be this like the grass is always greener kind of feeling towards artists and writers, and particularly because academia is so hard, right? It's like, especially if you do also write or you do make other kinds of art, you are always kind of warring for your time within the academic system to like do the thing that you actually love when you have all of this other work that you have to do, your administrative work, your grading, all of those kinds of things, your teaching. But to me, the cautionary tale of someone like Lois is when you have all the freedom in the world, your life actually loses meaning. Like if there are no constraints and no one there to actually tether you to the world, and make you do boring shit sometimes, your art becomes really meaningless. And that was kind of how I thought about her. Like, if Lara, it's unclear what Lara's future will be, but like there is some value in not having, just as like some of these people who have so much privilege are just so untethered from reality that like everything is meaningless. Like they can make art by burning, $100 bills. Like other, it stops being fun. It stops being creative and starts just being masturbatory. And I think Lois kind of has a little bit of that energy.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I'm mulling. I'm taking that in. I don't know if I don't know if I want to believe that freedom is always bad or deleterious for art. Now, I know that you're not suggesting that, or but certainly, yes, I think there is and also a sort of restlessness in Lois, right? That she's constantly doing something new and different and saying, well, this will be it. This will be it. This will be it. And again, like all the characters, these are things that are, part of me, or ways that I want to, ways I can play out of impulses I know, But yeah, it's an interesting question about Lois as a figure for the artist in this book.
Well, I think total freedom with no responsibility starts to become meaningless, right? Like freedom is only exciting and only feels free if you have some context for responsibility, right? That's more what I.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just, yeah, I'm thinking about that. Yeah.
So we have a great question from our friend Robin in the chat. What characters or themes did not get incorporated into the final draft that you wanted to explore more or include?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I'm trying to think back about, to answer this question completely accurately. I think there was in earlier drafts more about Ennis Weatherfield, like the character whose money funded the scholarship. So more about him. And that was also, the historical research was kind of fun, and there was a sort of freedom. I mean, imagining what could have been, but that ended up. I kind of wanted to keep the balance more on Florence and then on the contemporary story. So that kind of, most of that left the novel, and then it was. I think there was. I actually thought, this goes back to, I think, your first question, ER, and then some of the other topics we're talking about. I thought there would be more about war itself in this novel. And part of the, I think, journey of the novel, or that sounds kind of preposterous, but the evolution of the drafts was Laura and me and the book realizing that really, the fact that Laura couldn't write about that was part of the story. Like, that was not her experience, and there is a kind of opacity there in Mark's character, and then in their relationship, Laura and Mark's relationship. So I tried that like dozens and dozens of different ways, and that mostly in the first chapter and the last chapter, where I thought at various times there would be more about experiences of war itself more directly, and it just didn't. It wasn't there. It just wasn't. And that I think not frustration, but that, I think, boundary or border, or that's an experience that Laura's never going to have, or does not have, was actually part of the book. But it took me a while to figure that out. So that was also in the earlier drafts.
I think it's really interesting, actually, that we never hear any of his speech, right? Like, he's giving speeches about war, but we don't hear it. Like, she goes to
Yes,
listen
that's
to it.
true.
I think that's smart, because, I was thinking as a reader, and again, being part of this micro generation, of like how this war has gone on through the background of our entire adulthood. And, I certainly had friends who did tours in Iraq when I was in college, right? Like we graduated from high school and they went to war, and I went to my cushy scholarship funded college, right? And I knew people, and I had cousins who went, and I, like, certainly people in our age cohort who were there, but it was very easy for us. I went to protests. I didn't go to war, right? It was very easy for us to sort of chug along with this happening in the background. And the fact that it is only just winding down in the last year is so surreal, because now we look back and, you're teaching people who were our age, like I'm, working with young people all the time. And I'm like, oh shit, you weren't born yet. Like, you weren't born when this war started. And I think I find the historical comparison to other wars really helpful, because I think we think about, like, what are good war. I don't, because I think all war is bad, but like, as a narrative in America, like, we think about what are the just wars, what are the good wars, what are the useful wars. And the more we look at all of these American wars, the more we see they're all about imperialism, right? Like, or they're all about land and money and power, right?
Yeah, well, I'm just stuck on the earlier part of your comment. I wish I had so much more historical knowledge and political science knowledge to be able to comment um, really well about this, but I don't. But I do wonder, and just thinking about your insight about this experience, and I do wonder a lot about how, um, you know, decades on, this time, and we'll probably wonder about this, is kind of a cliche, how this time in history will be described and accounted for and thought about. And the war is both like the most important thing and sometimes seems like the least important in the kind of in US society during the early 20th century, right? That because precisely what you're saying, many people could feel separate from it in a way, and yet it was and is so central to the world that we're living in, and in all sorts of ways in our politics. And I think we're only, even though, I'm speaking for myself, even though I lived through it, I'm only beginning to understand how central it is still now, and I'm continuing to learn more about how it has shaped everything, and goes on shaping everything. And this is not to diminish the importance of other tragedies and other important historical and social changes of the 21st century, but I do think it's a really difficult problem of how we think about this, and then and how we change some of the world it's made.
Yeah, I do think it is going to be our generational thing to wrestle with in art. And I was trying to think about other books about Iraq and Afghanistan that are not written by veterans. And the only one I could think of that I thought was actually good, besides yours, was Ohio by Stephen Markley. I don't know if you've read that.
Oh, I haven't read that. I'll write it down.
I loved that book, but that is another book about what it means to be on the sidelines when your friends go to war and you are not the one that goes. Because certainly, another friend of ours, Odie Lindsay, is a veteran, but he was a veteran of the first Iraq war. And he's written some stuff about being a veteran, and Kevin Powers. There are other people who are writing contemporary stuff who are veterans, but there's not a lot about the experience of being of our generation and staying at home and watching it, on TV, or not watching it, which is really the more common experience of turning away, and of trying to make sense of it, like when it is forced upon us. And I do think that's such important in terms of the ethics of this book, which are about looking, when do you look and when you not. It feels like such an important, subtle through line through this entire story.
Yeah, and how something can be like everywhere and nowhere in consciousness in the world. I think I'm thinking about that, and like what you're saying about fiction in the 21st century, and how I think it's there in the, like, not background, but there in glancingly and in backgrounds or in places in many fictional works and just kind of imaginative works generally. But it's going to take a while, I think, to like figure out how we're going to look back on that and characterize it and think through it. Fiction will help us do that, I think. But
yeah,
I don't know, I love reading, so I would say that.
Yes. So Frankie asked another great question. She says, there is such a constellation of fiction in the novel. The art of fiction, character, incident, fictions about history, the fictions the characters create around themselves. Your role as the novelist. How did you think about the balance of showing and telling fiction as your novel evolved? And I guess I would just add to that, like, the structure of this book is really incredible. Like you're doing a very complex, smart thing here that's really hard to pull off. So I don't, if you want to talk a little bit about how all of that showing and telling and weaving together came to be, because it's really well done.
Thank you. It's just so interesting because like there is this very common fictional advice of show, don't tell. And then, of course, that's a very common fictional advice. But there's also been recently, and really recently, very interesting and encouraging developments of various writers kind of questioning and also trying to revise these common fiction workshop pieces of advice. I'm thinking of like Matthew Salasis's book and other historical work about the fiction workshop and where it came from, and various work on like the structure of fiction. There are other works that are doing this, and just saying, well, maybe it's not, maybe the rules they're never really rules. They're just kind of guidelines or, suggestions. But in showing and telling, I think a lot of really wonderful, powerful moments in fiction that I love are moments of telling, but it's more a matter of thinking about how, like, balancing showing and telling, right? The parts where you get a piece of information or wisdom or insight, and then the parts where you get that's exactly at the craft in the real world. And then there's Meander, Spiral, Explode, which is another great book that my sister gave me and I've been rereading. And so thinking about the balance of showing and telling, and how showing sets up telling and vice versa, and how you can kind of play with the different, like the emotional effects, almost like a composition in music or film editing, right? So in terms of the structure of this book, I started out with a pretty rigid structure, rigid, for a couple of reasons. One, I think, nervous about writing fiction, but then also I really wanted, the part of the impulse, like part of the energy of the book to be like the energy of a person, a consciousness, Laura herself, finding the right form, like finding the right way to tell something is part of the book's like forward motion, or part of her impetus and the book's impetus. And also because I know I was reading and loving and inspired by lots of poets. And I was thinking about the feeling of reading a collection of poetry, not all collections, but many collections, where you feel the collection moving through different forms, and often like thinking of like using the movement of form and the experimentation or different kinds of form as part of the joy and the movement of the book. So, something like Claudia Rankine's work, like Don't Let Me Be Lonely, or Citizen, or like Layli Long Soldier, like Whereas, or Maggie Nelson. Well, she's poet writing nonfiction, or there's lots of examples of this, but that sense of like moving from form to form. So I had like a different formal idea for different parts of the book. And then like kind of let them kind of not talk to each other in a way, and that was part of Laura not only trying to find a way of looking at the whole experience, but then also Laura kind of wondering what research is for and what art is for, right? And she does, as this great question, Frankie's question said, near the end of the book, she does kind of come down on this very famous judgment from Henry James about character and incident, like, basically plot and people, which are the building blocks of fiction. And Laura's like, are they? So, which is her doubt about herself, really. But so that's also part of the book's kind of formal uncertainty. And it's not really, it could be experimentation, but it doesn't feel to me, or I wasn't trying to make it feel like experimentation so much as just like searching and uncertainty and testing maybe different ways of putting a shape onto this experience. or putting this experience into shape.
Yeah, I think it comes across so well, and it's such an exciting way to experience the book because you're going through and you really do feel seated in Laura's consciousness in a way that, as she kind of gets more, empowered in some ways, her language changes, her relationship to these texts changes, her relationship to these people changes, to the Weatherfield changes, all of it changes, and we kind of the language changes alongside her, and that's really exciting because you feel the momentum. I think there's like in the shipping news, I don't know if you read that way back when, but on a
Yeah.
syntactical level, his sentences get longer, or the author's sentences, but narratively they get longer the more he sort of emotionally opens up, and it's
Yeah.
like she goes from these very staccato rhythms, these really beautiful language sentences by the end as he becomes a more emotionally open, unfurled kind of human, and falls in love and all that. And I think there's a similar sort of analogous thing happening here where it's like, she says over and over again, I'm fine, like throughout the book, I'm fine. As both like a defense and also as a kind of, I think she doesn't know. Like, I think she just genuinely isn't interrogating she's not taking in what people are actually asking of her. And so she's like, well, why would you even want to know about how I am?
Right.
It feels very
Yeah.
self-protective. And then by the end, she's starting to have real responses to people. And that feels like
Right.
it's opening up. And I think as the reader who's going along with her, we feel that experientially, which is really cool. And again, like as someone struggling through, the second draft of my book, I'm just like, people don't realize how hard that is. Like, it's very
Oh,
hard.
thanks.
And I think it's great to do. And I, as with all art, it's like the stuff that actually feels really seamless is the stuff that is really hard to do.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that. I mean, it felt, I guess, maybe this is, I don't know, a good thing, bad thing, but it felt really like the only way to do this, at least from the beginning. Like, it was the way I could get into this story and these characters. And then it was a way, okay, this is the only way to do it. How do I do it and keep doing it well, or as well as I possibly can. And that attempt was like the forward motion of the novel.
So the kind of closing question that I often like to ask fiction writers is, you mentioned James Baldwin, obviously Henry James, and then some poets just now, but we like to think of sort of our Charis canon, or the books that our books are in conversation with. And I know there is an impulse to always be humble, but like, I'm really asking you to be not humble and to say, like, what books do you want, or do you kind of think of your book as being in conversation with throughout time? Like, who are the other books that you're kind of writing to or thinking about?
Wow, that is a huge question. Well, I don't entirely know, but I would say, I would like to think that my book is in conversation with other books that are focused on character and form, and how those two things are not mutually exclusive and not fighting with each other, but actually like mutually informing and creating each other. So I think there are elements of that in so many works. And yeah, so I can't even, I mean, that I will say that yeah. But so some of the poetry books that I was just mentioning are like recent books that I really love and think about. But then I was also, just because I was teaching this, I was thinking about how this works, that interplay in, for example, Gwendolyn Brooks's great sequence, Gay Chaps at the Bar, which is in her first book, Street in Bronzeville. I think I got that title correct. But it's a sonnet sequence about World War II. So I was just thinking about it too, because you're talking about war and the experience of war, and Brooks, writing from her position in the U.S. about this war, and writing like very close to like right in the moment, and using the sonnet form, and then writing from different sorts of experiences, and from soldiers' experiences, and really suggesting in that sequence like everything that the war changed or could change about society. And perhaps I just read it, but I was thinking like that it's such a concise, and it's so beautiful and so rich, and that is sort of what I think that interplay of character and form can do. But that's not a very satisfying maybe answer to your question.
No.
Yeah, I think that I would like to think about so many wonderful like nonfiction or experimental creative nonfiction books, and how they think through talking about topics and using formal ingenuity to do that, and then bringing into that the richness of character and the importance of character in all the best and most exciting fiction I love. That kind of overlap is what I would like to feel is the diagram of my interests.
Yeah, the sweet and sweet spot.
Yeah.
Totally. Is there any writer or any contemporary fiction that you just want to recommend that you're enjoying right now?
Contemporary fiction.
Not necessarily. It doesn't have to be like hot off the press. I just mean that
right. Yeah.
Contemporarily, it could be 200 years old if you
want. Well, I will recommend a book that there's something. Yeah. So right now I'm reading a lot of fiction for what I hope may be another book, which I'm kind of being more deliberate about the kind of fiction I want to put together for that, the feel of that book. And so for that, Gwendolyn Brooks is there, but also Penelope Fitzgerald, who is a fiction writer I absolutely love. So if anyone hasn't read Penelope Fitzgerald, please do read The Blue Flower, but also read Gate of Angels, which might be my favorite. Human Voices is also really great, really funny. And that's about war. Not that we're getting back there, but so I'm reading a lot of her work, and then Shirley Hazard, whom I just begun to read and love. In more contemporary, those are not contemporary. In more contemporary, not exactly contemporary, but I would recommend Akhil Sharma's novel Family Life, which I think was just absolutely wonderful. And I think it was widely read and admired, but I don't think for me widely enough. But I really love that book. And he also wrote some wonderful things about the craft of that book and how he created the tone and feel of that book, which are fabulous. The book is just so beautifully constructed and moving and poignant. So I would recommend that as well. Yeah, and there are dozens. I mean, most of the books I love and reread often are books that you already know. But those are some that I can think of that you might not have read, and then also that I'm reading and thinking about right now.
I love that. I do want to let you know that a writerly biography of Shirley Hazard is coming out in the fall that people are very
fabulous.
Yes, so it's called
great.
Shirley Hazard: A Writer's Life. So I will drop that.
Oh wow, that's great.
So yes, so I've not read any of those. I don't know anything about those, so that's very exciting to new directions.
Yeah. And I'll think of more as soon as the conversation's over.
Yes.
Oh, another writer that I really love, and I think has been really influential for me, and I think is a great writer, kind of at the border of different genres, is Juliana Spar. I think her work is amazing. She wrote This Connection of Everything with Lungs, which is a book that was written right around the time of the beginning of the Iraq War, but she's written many books since then. That Winter the Wolf Came is one of her recent books, and it's kind of on the border of poetry and prose, and just absolutely gorgeous, and recommend that too. That just popped into my head, so I figured I'd say so.
Yeah, thank you. I'll put that in the chat as well, for folks who are watching at home and want to be inspired. So of course, for folks who are watching at home, if you don't have a copy of Benefit yet, please click this teal button at the bottom of the screen. Buy it from Charis. It really does help us when you purchase your books from us. Also support this wonderful press. Bellevue Literary Press is a great press. They are very discerning. They've done a wonderful job promoting this book, and it's always exciting when small presses do really good things, and so we've been really happy with how they have supported this book so far. So really excited for you to be with them, because they do really good stuff. So you can also.
Thank you. I'm excited too.
Yeah,
and honored. Yeah,
they've done a great job, and somebody was saying, they've done a really good job of promoting it, and it's because they are discerning, and they choose a handful of titles, and that's what they do, and that really does make a difference. And so it's important for folks. It means that much more when you buy a book from a small press. I'll just say that. But you also can ask that your library carry the book, because that helps as well. So your public library, and also if you're a college student, your collegiate library, both of those things help a lot. And it is a way to keep the book in the conversation. Of course, you can review it online, and encourage your friends to read it and buy it as well. So keep the conversation going. I know that you are not big on social media, Siobhan, but is there any place that you want people to follow your writing and your work?
No, I don't use social media that much. I probably should. I certainly no, but no, I don't think so. I hope to write more books in the future. But for now, yes. There may be other conversations, but in the nearish future about this book. But that's it for now, and we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, so keep an eye out on Bellevue Literary Press's social media.
Yes, definitely.
All of Siobhan's events, and we'll keep an eye out for future work from you. But for real, congratulations. This has been so lovely. I'm so honored to get to talk to you. Thanks to all of our friends watching at home. And do let folks know we'll be adding this to our YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/Charis Circle, and they can watch this without having to register. It'll be up in about 24 hours, and we'll share it far and wide so more folks can see it then as well. So, Siobhan, I hope that we will get to hang out with each other and our lovely crew of friends sometime in real life soon. But this has been great, and I'm just so excited about this book, and excited to sell it to people and get it into lots of people's hands, because it's truly a huge success.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at Charis. It's really an honor to be part of, even virtually part of this place. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And, eventually we'll get you down here for your next book for a live.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
Until then, take care, be safe, and
thank you.
And enjoy this wonderful achievement.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks for all the wonderful questions. It's really a pleasure.